sure what the level is. Since I am not quite sure what the level was in terms of how much you knew about business and how businesses and organizations like ours see climate and health. I also didn't know if you knew much about the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. What I have done is prepared a presentation that I hope will give you, within the time limit, enough information about who we are and what we do, a little bit of history around business and sustainability and where the conversation is now, how it links to climate action, but also to other key topics for sustainability long-term. And finally, the Council's agenda on health and climate action and why it's important to business. Next slide, please. So let me start by saying a little bit more about WBCSD. So the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD in short, which is what I'm going to use moving forward, or council, is an organization that has been here for over 20 years. And our vision is to have a world that lives within planetary boundaries and that allows individuals to live well by 2050. And our mission is to make sustainable business more successful while creating societal value. What that means for us is that we are not afraid of embracing the fact that business has a huge responsibility in terms of building the world that we need, and that responsibility cannot be limited to shareholder interests or to increasing our revenue. In our case, it means stating that having a robust case around integrating sustainability and having sustainable business models is good for business, and it makes them successful. And it really brings the level of collaboration that is needed to address the changes that are needed worldwide today by 2030 and by 2050. So that relates as well with the achievement of the SDGs and the Paris Agreement and the climate agenda. What makes us unique, perhaps, is that if you think about us, our role is not necessarily to move projects per se, but really elevate the conversation and help transform business. This is a space where we've dedicated our commitment to create an environment that is pre-competitive and that allows open discussion across sectors and within competitors. Think of commodities, think of industries in health that can have relevant conversations around sustainability. Next slide. So we are over 200 companies working together at the forefront of these conversations to really create transformational change. And in that sense, I can bring a couple of examples that are relevant to this topic. For example, the GHG protocol, which basically sets the standards to measure and manage emissions. Why is that key? Because there is no way on earth that we can tackle climate emissions, reduce them, and reach net zero or clean energy or a clean environment or a clean economy or societies without issues related to climate challenges if we are not able to measure. So that is a key starting point. There are other examples, but I'll perhaps leave them to questions that you may have in the future. Next slide, please. So in that context, one caveat that is very substantive is that when you think about business, you think about the traditional sentence, business as usual. And that traditional sentence, business as usual, is the classic business model that refers to finding shareholder value. So how much money can we get for our investors, for our owners? An extractive model, take from nature, take from anything, produce, and then discard or waste. and then really make everything in a way that is motivated by profit. That is a traditional model that has existed for a while, but within that model, within that business ecosystem, there's a unique group of companies that since 1993 and even earlier in the context of Rio had worked really hard to break through the sustainability space and create awareness around the role that they played in creating societies where sustainability was at the core of what sustainability systems do. Why is that important? Because it means that sustainability is not seen as an appendix of something, it's seen as being at the core of what business does. And you have to think of it in different levels. For example, business is one of the main trusted sources of transparency in the world today. Business is one of the main sources of employment, but business is also responsible for a large part of the environmental, social, and economical issues that we have today. So there's a huge burden in business and acting positively to change that environment. Next slide, please. And this is just to give you a quick overview of what that unique mindset for sustainable business means and the transformation that we have seen. So if you think about a corporation, what you would see is that the traditional business as usual model defends a model where you have your typical corporate volunteering office, your CSR office, or your philanthropic office, donating funds for a school here and there, or planting 3 trees. And it's absolutely okay to do that, but it won't transform the world. The companies that work at WBCSD and with WBCSD are companies that are completely committed to integrating sustainability into their business. There are companies that are aligning their purpose, their operations, and their corporate strategy to sustainability. So think of Patagonia, think of Biogen, for example, which are companies that really put people at the center, put nature at the center, and figure out ways in which the model is no longer linear and extractive, but circular, and is thinking about business solutions that change the world. Think, for example, of Nike making shoes out of ocean waste, plastic ocean waste, to divert waste that goes to the oceans. That's a very basic but very common and also well-known example of how companies are starting to see this. Next slide, please. And in that context, what we have faced is that as an organization is that while at the beginning we were talking about making sustainability the core of business, the environment is so complex that we have to, as business, as an organization that leads the voice of business, we have to pay attention to 3 major crises of our time: climate emergency, nature and biodiversity loss, and social injustice. And the reason I put the 3 here is because while we're going to talk about health today and its interconnection with climate, you'll see that they're all articulated and they're interdependent. And I'll bring an example in a little bit around health when we start discussing climate and climate action and health. But basically at the core of this is that our organization and our members are committed to transformational change that goes far beyond, net zero commitments, to really aligning their actions and their models and their products and services to concrete science-based objectives that defend the business case for sustainability. Next slide. And why is this important? And here's where I have to be a little bit pragmatic, because while philanthropy is key, if a business is not financially successful and it doesn't have a license to operate, then it won't thrive. So a key part of the work that we do and the part of the work that our business leaders and corporate leadership in sustainability does is really make sure that we build a business case that defends that in the context of what's relevant to a company. The climate emergency nature and biodiversity loss, social injustice are all issues that can cause risk to business. For example, think of Volkswagen and what happened with the GHG emissions and carbon emissions and the recall of the coals and the scandal that they had to face. Environmental disruptions that are also a risk for their business. Think of, for example, what's going on with supply chains and how economies are affected. Good case, Germany right now, in terms of how they're impacting not only the people in terms of the environmental footprint, but the cost of business to recover if they're not resilient. Social unrest, a great example, you've seen it globally, is the tension that communities have to face due to climate injustice. And the last one is the liability or the risk or legal liability that they have because of the type of behaviors that impacting, for example, the environment, can impact communities and then imply legal danger to those companies. Think of companies that have to pay huge fines like Johnson & Johnson and the opioid crisis here in the US, or cleaning an oil spill up like the one that, you know, Anadarko, a Texas oil company, had to do because of the implications of their business in that, having that responsibility. I believe it's a case of like $6 billion that they had to pay. So that means that there's a huge cost for companies if they don't pay attention to this. I'll share more examples with you. Next slide, please. And now if you bring that into the context of health, next slide, please. What you'll see is that while it's also, sorry, could you go back just a second? I'll go quickly over it. While you have the opportunity to create societal value and address issues as the one with the examples of current impacts, you can also see how business, if it doesn't engage in addressing with their cloud and with the resources, the challenges and creating solutions, it's even worse for their business. One basic metric, and this is where I wanted to bring the example to you because it's relevant to us today, is COVID-19. The companies that have experienced large-scale disruptions because of COVID-19 have done so not only in terms of their supply chains, but in terms of the impact in the labor force, of employees who suffer not only from health issues around COVID and the financial burden, but also of the emotional and mental disruption that this creates and how it affects business. So that also links to something that has been very tied to the health industry in terms of companies only looking at health and well-being and the risk hazards at your employment side. But it goes beyond that. It goes into the fact that entire supply chains of food, of products, of retail can be disrupted by issues such as a pandemic. And then that can revert in even more impactful environments that create social unrest because there's an economic burden. This is where I think that it's valuable not only to bring to you the position we have around climate action, but also how strongly we link it to nature and biodiversity loss and the health and well-being of individuals. Next slide, please. I see I'm
15 minutes.
Oh my God, I'm sorry, I'm terrible at this.
No problem.
I'll take 2 more minutes more because this is the more important, and I'll let you scroll through it. Next slide, please. So basically what WBCSD does is cover 6 economic systems. The one that covers health and society is under the people program. But what is key about those economic systems is that it's aligned with our project portfolio. Next slide, please. And within that project portfolio, we follow the SDGs and the Paris Agreement through a key piece of work that we have, which is Vision 2050. It's not just a motto, it's not just a line, it's a 90-pager that describes exactly what business needs to do. Next slide. And that piece globally was curated by experts, by business, and by communities. And it identified 9 pathways to get the transformation we want and we need. And one of those, as you see here, is the health and well-being pathway. Next slide. So here is just a snapshot of what the health and well-being pathway is. Of course, I've already run out of time, but if you have a chance, look at it. I'm happy to jump on a call with you. What is key is to remember that what companies are doing now is really figuring out how to deal with the problems that climate is, the problems of climate and the connection with health and well-being of employees and the communities they operate, because without healthy employees and healthy communities, they cannot thrive. Thank you, and I'm very sorry for being very, very late for this presentation.
No, thank you so much. It was really important information, and to share with us the challenges that the private sector is facing, but also how poor health impacts workers. So thank you once again for taking the time to speak to us today.
My pleasure, and good luck. And you have my details and public information that you need with this recording, and I guess with this presentation as well. Take care and good luck.
The role of environmental exposures in the development of cardiovascular disease. Dr. Chang has published seminal papers showing the particulate matter air pollution exposure has a measurable impact on cardiovascular risk factors, clinical outcomes, and mortality. In addition to his work in environmental epidemiology, Dr. Chang has made important contributions in estimating the individual air pollution exposure with statistical models. Thank you all for joining me and welcoming Dr. Chang.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good night. My name is Zhenyu Zhang. I'm assistant professor at Peking University. Today, I'm going to speak as a delegate of an environmental activist. As we all know that a minor action we took in the past could have massively impact on our current lives, but we neglect to see those minor actions we take today could also have massive impact on the future. This idea of a butterfly effect works both positively and negatively. If we make small changes, they will add up over time and benefit the future. But if we continue to make a poor decision, the effects will snowball automatically and causing our downfall. One example of a butterfly effect can be seen in climate change. Climate change is the most important and difficult issue humanity faces. The IPCC report is clear that humanity is equivocally to blame for the rising temperature. Last month, some of the world's leading climate change scientists confirmed that humans are making irreversible change to our planet, and the extreme weather will only become more severe. So we need to quickly stop putting the greenhouse gas into the atmosphere and quickly start taking them back out. To avoid the worst consequence, we're going to have to keep the global increase in temperature below 1.5 degrees Celsius. I believe you all understand why it's so important to stay below 1.5 degrees C, because even 1 degree, people are dying from the climate crisis. Because that is what the United Science call for to avoid destabilizing the climate. All countries have the responsibility to reduce the greenhouse gas emission according to the Paris Climate Agreements of 2015. However, some countries are finding clever ways around having to take real action, like double counting emissions reductions and moving their emission overseas and working back on their promise to increase the ambition or refusing to pay for the solutions or lose and damage. This must stop. What we need is real drastic emission cuts at the source. But of course, just reducing emission is not enough. We also need to keep the carbon in the ground. Only setting up distant days and saying things which give the impression of that action is underway will most likely do more harm than good. Because the changes required are still nowhere in sight. The politics needed does not exist today, despite what you might heard from from the world leaders. And I still believe that the biggest danger is not in action. The real danger is when the politicians and the CEOs are making it look like the real action is happening, when in fact almost nothing is being done apart from clever accounting. As an environmental activist, my experience is that the lack of awareness is the same everywhere. Our leaders are not behaving as if we are in an emergency. I believe if there is a child standing in the middle of the road and the car are coming at full speed, you don't look away because it's too uncomfortable. You must immediately run out and rescue that child. And without that sense of urgency, how can we people understand that we are facing a real crisis? And if people are not fully aware of what is going on, then they will not put pressure on the people in power to act. And without the pressure from the people, our leader can get away and basically not doing anything. The Children Climate Risk Index reveals a disturbing global inequities when it comes to the worst effect of climate change. 33 countries, including the Central African Republic, Chile, Niagara, Guinea, are considered extremely high risk for children. But those countries collectively emit just 9% of global carbon dioxide emission. 10 countries with the highest emission, including China, the United States, Russia, and Japan, collectively accounting for nearly 70% of global emission. And the children in those higher emitting nations face lower risk. Only one of those countries, India, is ranking as extremely high risk in the report. Many high-risk countries are poor nations from the global south, and there people will be most impacted, despite contributing the less to a problem. We will not allow the industrialized countries to duck the responsibility for suffering of the children in other parts of the world. Rich countries need to do their fair share and get down to the real zero emission much faster, and then help the poor countries to do the same. So people in the less fortunate parts of the world can rise in their living standards. Luckily, we know exactly what's causing the climate change. We can absolutely avoid the worst and build a better world in process. But we know that this is a problem. We know how to solve it. Like renewable energy is skyrocketing, and the solar is producing just 1% of world energy right now, but it's increasing faster every year. So there are things you can do to mitigate your impact, such as eat less, no meat, especially not beef, never buy a gas-powered car, prefer small homes, don't buy gas stove, live closer to where you work. But also one of the most important things anyone can do is to be informed on different policies and laws that the government create to try to solve this problem. Because we cannot do this without an informed public. And the policies need advocacy. So they need people who understand it. Also, there are strategies governments could use to rapidly decrease their emissions. One of the most effective one is carbon pricing. If releasing carbon dioxide is free, people don't have any reason not to do that. But it is actually not free. It's going to cost a tremendous amount of money to deal with the consequence of the emission of that carbon. But the money isn't being paid by the people producing the emission, or the people consuming the energy, the gas, the steel, the concrete that create the emissions. Those costs will be borne by the people in the future. And there will be the wildfire, and the droughts, and the famines, and the wars, and the refugees, and the sea level rise. All of those costs are not being priced in. So carbon pricing just includes those costs. The basic way is that when a fossil fuel or other source of emission enter the economy, whether it's at the moment or when it's taken out of the ground, or at the moment when we import it, we tax it. You say, You can see that this is will soon be burned, and they will produce tons of carbon. And the tons of carbon is going to cost worth $50 to deal with in the future. So we're going to make the thing cost $50 extra. This is by far the simplest things I suggest to in place. It's easy to regulate. Everyone pay the same flat rate, and this significantly increase the cost of a fossil fuel. Thus, encouraging investment and innovation in other types of energy options. Now we have less than 100 days until the UN Climate Change Conference, we also know as the COP26 in Glasgow. The world's climate scientists have made it clear that the time is now. We must act urgently to avoid the worst possible consequence. We're in the crisis of a crisis, a pollution crisis, a climate crisis. So I'm going back to the idea of a butterfly effect. When we make a small contribution, they will add up across communities. Greta Thunberg is at the forefront of climate strike. You don't need to participate in the strike to have an impact. You just need to follow the different policies and laws that governments create to try to solve the problem. Let's take a step back for a second to put all of this into perspective. If we each do our part in fighting against the climate change, we just might be able to subvert a slow and painful death for thousands and thousands of species. We may never get the opportunity to travel backwards in time, but you do have the opportunity to shift the entire fate of our planet. I'm going to wrap up with the words from the Ernest Hemingway. The earth is a fine place and worth fighting for, and the power to do that is in your hand. Thank you. This is all my speak.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cheng. That was very inspiring. Thank you. And now it is with great pleasure that I introduce our final activist speaker for this evening. Dr. Rhys Jones, pronounced Ngati Kahungunu, is a public health physician and senior lecturer in Maori health at the University of Auckland, Otaria, New Zealand. His research addresses Indigenous health and health equity with a particular focus on environmental influences on Maori health and well-being. He is a passionate advocate for action on the social determinants of health, equity, and Indigenous rights. He was the founding co-convener of Orataio, the New Zealand Climate and Health Council, a health professional organization focusing on the health challenges of climate change and the health opportunities of climate change. So thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your talk with us.
Kia ora, Melissa, thank you very much. And thanks very much for the opportunity to speak with you all today. In my talk, I'm really going to be sharing some ideas about global climate action and thinking about the need to really understand the problem and conceptualize that in the right way if we're going to actually find the right solutions. And so I'm thinking about taking us from this idea of decarbonization or reducing global greenhouse gas emissions more to think about decolonization. So next slide, please. And apologies for this poor graphic here, but essentially the way I think about climate change within the context of broader global economic and environmental issues is that it's not so much just due to greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere or due to the ways in which we're using different types of energy, but it's actually about those broader systems of colonialism, capitalism that are driving these changes. So part of the problem with climate action is that we tend to focus on these relatively surface level interventions or solutions to try and, for example, change the type of fuels we're using, rather than actually trying to fundamentally change the systems that we're operating under. So yeah, next slide, please. And I really want to take us back to the idea that climate change didn't just start when we started burning fossil fuels and emitting lots of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The origins actually lie right back at the beginning of this kind of process of colonialism or colonization, right back when some human societies disconnected from nature, when some human populations decided that we were superior to other beings, superior to even other people, and saw the planet and the earth and the natural environment not as one of our relatives, as we would see it in indigenous cultures, not as an ancestor, but started to see it as a resource to be exploited and commodified. And from that point on, we've seen the reverberations of that kind of different change in relationships in a lot of the processes that have followed from there, including what we're seeing now in terms of the climate crisis. So yeah, next please. So just building on that a little bit, that in modern colonial societies, they're founded on this kind of fundamental idea that humans are superior to other beings and disconnected in many ways from the rest of nature. Whereas, you know, in indigenous cultures, we would see trees, plants, fish, birds, animals, all living things as being our relatives, and recognizing that their well-being and the well-being of the earth, the rivers, the lakes, the seas, the natural world very much influences our own opportunities to be healthy and to be well. And so, you know, the health of humans is actually inseparable from the health and well-being of everything around us. And that's where the problems lie in terms of climate change, and that being really just a symptom of the underlying problem, which is colonialism and extractive capitalism. So next, please. And so we're seeing that in terms of the impacts of climate change, but also in terms of who is largely responsible for the impacts of climate change. And so these two slightly distorted maps try to illustrate this, the huge inequities that exist in terms of the global climate crisis. So on the top there, we can see the world map distorted according to who's been largely responsible for climate change and for global greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, you know, when groups like the IPCC say climate change is undeniably due to human activity, yes, that is correct, but it's not all humans who are equally responsible. And so we can clearly see that the wealthier countries, particularly North America, Europe, have been largely responsible for climate change. And yet, if we look at the bottom in terms of who's being impacted by climate change, we see that's largely the poorer countries, and at least at the moment, particularly Africa, India, largely being impacted, along with many other countries that are probably a little bit too small to see on that map. Next, please. And so you can see the impacts of colonialism and the way that climate change is due to exploitation of some groups by others in terms of that global distribution of who's responsible and who's bearing the brunt of climate change impacts. And certainly we're getting to a point now where there's urgency seen that's clearly having impacts right now, and scientists are trying to urge our leaders, our politicians, but all of us to really act and act seriously. Yeah, next, thanks. But the ways in which we act are really important. And as I alluded to earlier, you know, a lot of the ways in which we're trying to address climate change are really just putting a band-aid on the underlying issues. So one of my favorite areas that gives an example of this is in transport. And much of our transport policy in terms of reducing emissions, at least in countries like Aotearoa, New Zealand, and I think in many other countries, really relies on quite a bit on shifting fossil fueled vehicles to electric powered vehicles. And just click on through here, please. You can see here that this really just replaces one kind of problem with another kind of problem, and it's because it's not addressing the underlying issues of extractive capitalism and colonialism. It's really just shifting to a different form of extractive capitalism and colonialism. So if we move towards more electric cars, we're going to see more human rights abuses, environmental abuses in places that have many of the minerals and resources that are required for the batteries for electric vehicles, for example. So just an example of how that can, you know, trying to solve one problem can end up just creating a whole lot of other problems. Next, please. And this really illustrates how, in many ways, we're trying to solve the climate crisis from the same sort of consciousness, from the same worldviews and ideologies, that of sort of Western capitalism and colonialism, that is actually responsible for the problem in the first place. So we need to think radically differently if we're going to actually solve the climate crisis. Next, please. And one thing I'd encourage you to think through, and particularly as you're working through your negotiations, is to think about a notion of climate justice, and justice applying in many, many different ways. So having a lot of different dimensions. So it's not just about distributive justice, or, you know, who gets the benefits and the burdens perhaps of any actions, but it's about procedures, you know, who's involved in the process, relational, you know, what are the relationships and who's got power, who hasn't, recognition, so whose people's knowledges are recognized and whose aren't, for example. There needs to be restorative justice, so addressing any historical inequities, you know, historical trauma and oppression, as well as thinking about the broader context and recognizing that many societies are very unequal at the moment due to various forms of oppression and discrimination. We need to take that into consideration whenever we're developing climate solutions, or any solutions for that matter. Next, please. And so really just to summarize, I think rather than thinking about climate change as a problem of using the wrong sorts of fuels or energy, or, you know, emitting too much greenhouse gases, we need to think about it more as starting from a fundamental disruption of essential relationships with everything in the world around us. And so renewing those relationships is critical. If our climate action doesn't act to restore those relationships, then we're simply going to be putting a band-aid on a much bigger problem. And so we have to center environmental justice. We have to think about all those different dimensions of justice, work in everything we do to dismantle colonialism and capitalism. And that really involves also restoring Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous knowledges, ways of knowing, doing, and being, because those will restore those connections that are essential for addressing the underlying factors driving the climate crisis. So that's all I have today. Kia ora, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jones, for that really incredible talk and insight. We really appreciate your presence and taking the time to be here.